Good afternoon, thank you. Welcome to the Cabinet Member for Housing Decision Meeting. I'm Councillor Darren Sanders, said Cabinet Member for Housing. So I'll start with a few housekeeping things. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate this room and public gallery. There is nobody in the public gallery, so please evacuate this room by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with the Portsmouth Cultural Trust Fire Marshal regulations, anyone who signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should remember to sign out when leaving the building after today's meeting. One person's kindly turned up in a wheelchair and another one has got a killer buggy. Therefore, we will offer assistance to make sure we try and get you out safely. Okay, thank you. There is live web streaming for the massed hordes who are watching, and I would like to draw everyone's attention in this room to the fact that this meeting is being live streamed from a camera at a fixed location at the back of the meeting room, and the recording will be on the Council's website for your on-demand pleasure. The camera will mainly capture the backs of anyone making deputations, but there will be some footage of them as they approach, which they've already done. So there's only footage of the back of their heads, and if they wish to leave the table where the microphones are located, and also people entering or leaving the room whilst the meeting is in progress. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly they do not wish to be recorded. However, we have the grand total of no one doing that. Please can everyone remember to use the microphones provided whilst they are speaking. Now I'd like to start by introducing everyone who is here, starting on my right. Joanne.
Joanne Milesmith, Democratic Services.
James Hill, Director of Housing, Neighbourhood and Building Services.
Paul Fielding, Assistant Director for Housing.
Claire Hardwick, Head of Private Sector Housing.
Mark Fitch, Head of Local Authority Housing.
Shane Galvin, Housing Policy and Quality Manager.
Wayne Layton, Finance Manager.
Martin Silman, Portsmouth and District Private Landlords Association.
Alwyn Oliver, Portsmouth and District Private Landlords Association and Flats in Southsea Letting Agency.
Pete Burton, CLG member for Ivy Close.
CLG member.
I'm Mada Abrams. I'm a member of the CLG group, and I'm the representative for South Somerstown.
Thank you. Cal?
Thank you.
Cal Corkery, I'm Councillor for Charles Dickens Wards and Opposition Spokesperson for Housing.
Councillor Scott Pacer-Harris, the Hillsey Ward Councillor and the Conservative Spokesperson for Housing.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Do we have any apologies for absence, Joe?
No, all members are here. There was one apology from a member of the Residents' Consortium, though.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, does anyone have any interest to declare? Cal?
I'm a Housing Association tenant and I'm also employed by a Housing Association. So I've been advised by the legal powers that be that I need to absent myself for agenda item 4.
Okay, thank you very much for telling me that, Cal. I have a declaration of interest which is with regards to item 5 around the private rented sector. I rent privately. I live in a shared house. However, as my shared house is already licensed, after long discussions with the city solicitor, I am able to take part in today's proceedings. So I'm going to. I understand I have had a dispensation. I wait to see it in writing. But there we go. So that's that. Now, in partly, hello. Thank you for coming. I was tempted to sort of delay the meeting for teas, coffees, vodkas. Sorry, this is Fiona Callingham from the news, so I will avoid do the introductions for her. We're only at the introductions and declarations of interest, okay, Fiona, but thank you very much for coming. So, given what Cal has said, and given that we've got deputations, I'm going to vary the order. Which is I'm going to do the tenancy strategy last, so Cal can get home early. and then start, because we've got deputations on making the private rented sector easier and safer before going into the homelessness strategy and then the tenancy strategy, so Cal can leave early if that's okay. So I wish to start with making the private rented sector easier and safer. And this may be for the benefit of those people watching online. This is something that we can do as politicians, but it's quite rare that we do, which is actually bring a paper to a meeting like this. I wanted to, for one very simple reason, in that over the past 18 months it's been very clear that the private rented sector has become a key part of our housing mix. We simply can't build our way out of the housing crisis that we have. And we've taken various actions as an administration over that. But following a review into selective licensing, which I asked officers to do, following some online stuff from Councillor Corkery and his Labour friends, it became clear to me that actually what was needed was something a bit wider than just being a one-club golfer. And so I've asked officers to go away and have a look at this. This was due to go before a special meeting for me on October the 1st. However, on the advice of Democratic Services, and with the agreement of the opposition spokespeople, it was postponed until now. So that's why this paper is here. So before I get into the pleasure of the deputations, Mr. Fielding, could you just explain a bit about the content, Ms. Hardwick, I apologise. Could you just explain a bit about what this is?
Absolutely, thank you. So the purpose of the report is to update members on the current issues in the private rental sector and outline some of the options available to tackle this. The background is that it's estimated approximately 20% of all homes in the city are privately rented. We've pulled together some data in Appendix 1 which indicates that the private rental sector doesn't work for some of those that live in it. So problems from the tenants living in the private rental sector can be broadly summarised as poor living conditions, rent affordability, lack of security of tenure, rent arrears and resulting evictions, issues around the statutory homelessness and other vulnerable people. And problems faced by some in the private rental sector as landlords can be broadly summarised as non-payment of rent, attracting and keeping tenants at a level of rent which is economically viable, antisocial behaviour, maintenance of the property structure and services, and maintaining flexibility of the use of the capital asset. Some of the potential options to tackle some of these issues include, but are not limited to, additional licensing of HMOs which fall outside of the current mandatory licensing criteria, selective licensing of all privately rented properties, targeted proactive inspections in certain areas of the city, use of an accreditation scheme, compulsory landlord registration, educating tenants about their rights and responsibilities, and landlords equally, and help for housing associations. All of these options available are complex, and if not carefully introduced with the correct knowledge, resources, or enforcement regimes, could lead to significant problems for individuals in the private rental sector market across Portsmouth. Through the research for this report, it's become clear that there needs to be a clear strategy which makes the private rental sector easier and safer. This should do the following. So build upon the Appendix 1 to find the data and case studies which would be used as evidence to create a strategy, and also in conjunction with legislation and national strategies, outline the Council's approach to the private rental sector in Portsmouth in a strategic document. So the recommendations are therefore that the Cabinet Member for Housing notes the report brought today, and that officers are tasked with developing a proposed private rental sector strategy for consideration by councillors in early 2020.
Thank you, Claire. Now I go to the deputations, which are each for 6 minutes, a maximum of 6 minutes, and I believe Joanne will have a stopwatch out to make sure it's fine. Who wishes to go first, Martin or Alwyn? Martin, thank you.
we're playing good cop, bad cop, if you wonder what's going on. I get the bad cop role, as usual, which I enjoy. Anyway, I think the key thing for us is, as politicians, you guys want to be seen to be solving problems and doing something. And as council officers, you either get your next promotion because you do good stuff, or you don't. So you're real keen to deliver. And there's no check and balance in terms of what it is you're being asked to deliver, or whether you're focusing on the right things or anything else. So I guess my bad cop role is, before you jump to solutions, please make sure you understand what the problem is better than you currently do, and do some proper analysis and evaluations of the solutions. I was here doing a deputation just like this, arguing against additional licensing 7 years ago. I've still got the file somewhere down here. I won't walk you through it. My argument then was the evidence was rubbish. There was, just like this actually, a general bits and pieces of PRS data which you found from a bunch of sources and put in as the intro, and then a bunch of totally unrelated facts and figures which you'd pulled from HSRS reviews and complaints and things, and it didn't, as a body of evidence, point to anything at all. It was just facts and figures, and yet on the back of that you introduced additional licensing. I sat through governance board meetings for 5 years, and we never took it to a judicial review or anything, because as it turned out, the administration were fairly benign, and they understood we were trying to do a job and they were trying to do a job, and they interpreted their own standards fairly, if that's the right way of putting it. You know, they always do, but what happened was basically, we lived with it. The pain wasn't as great as we'd feared, and it was okay. An observation, we had 5 years of governance board meetings, and I know, Darren, you sat through some of them, and you must have noticed my frustration. As each meeting I tried to hold Bruce and the team to task, because they couldn't give me an operational view of what was going on that related in any way, shape or form to the last one that we'd had, or the one before that. The concept of cumulative numbers and having an operational process which you can take a checkpoint from and see how it's changed since last time was completely beyond them. They did not have the skills. So I think my concern now is that I don't feel the administration is benign anymore. When I talk about homelessness in 20 minutes, half an hour's time, I'll give you some examples. But the view of the PDPLA is that we need to resist this a lot more strongly than we did then, because it's going to hurt us a lot more unless something changes. So we're going to ask for the evidence to be real evidence and real data. And just as an example, section 2, you've got, HHSRS. I know I've had discussions with some of you about category 2 hazards not being counted, because some of those are damp and mould. Is it tenant caused damp and mould, or is it landlord? Because it's a big difference. Is it really a problem, or is it someone doesn't know how to dry their clothes properly? Falls between levels, falls between floors. Talking to a landlord last week, his maisonette's been pulled up because the gap, the stair rods or balustrades or whatever are horizontal, and they're less than 4-inch gaps between each, but the gap at the bottom is 5 inches, which is 1 inch more than the 100 mm allowed. So he's been told, A, the gap's too big, a child could fall through, and B, because it's like a ladder, someone could climb over and fall over, so board it all in. The fact that it's an ex-council masonette in a block of 68 identical properties, that one has students, all the rest have small kids. Why it's suddenly an issue? Because it's the 4th time that place has been inspected since 2012. So my example of A, some of this data, you need to understand whether it's a real risk or not, and B, it's not as benign as it used to be. So I think I've probably rambled enough. My key request is the private sector housing team are very good at what they're trained to do, but they're not trained to do data analysis or data collection, and what you really need is some professional help, whether it be an academic or professional group. And I, rather than jumping to solutions, I would plead that you get a better set of data from which to decide what to do and do some real analysis of what that data tells you, rather than just what you've got at the moment is some facts and figures, and then suddenly jump to which solution should we do. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that, Martin. Alwyn.
Thank you so much, and I'm aware you're getting us twice today, and that you've allowed me to speak at quite short notice, so thank you for that. We are covering some of the same ground, some different. We both place strong value on evidence-based policy making. I oppose selective licensing, but would like to speak in favour of some form of reform. In fact, I think it's long overdue. I do want to commend the report that is before you today, and a lot of work has gone into it. Particularly glad to see the English Landlords Survey mentioned, as I think it was. The notes that I've got today, I've emailed to your three councillors. Thank you. The notes that I've sent today, I've emailed to the three councillors. I may not get through all of them, but there are some links I would encourage you to look at, as well as the many that are already there. On the papers you have today, at page 75 of your agenda pack, you've given a variety of reasons for arrears, and Claire's mentioned a few of them. But research elsewhere shows that 50% of universal credit claimants are 1 month in arrears, and 30% are 2 months in arrears. So the claimant system beyond your control is having a big impact. Further, just speaking as a landlord, you make no mention in the cause of arrears for any form of addiction or tenants spending money elsewhere. But in my experience, it has had a huge and devastating effect on tenants and therefore landlords alike. Indeed, in my 25 years as an agent and landlord, with having had 2,000 or so tenancies under my belt, of the 40 tenancies I've ended for arrears, 35 of those people were smokers, and many of them had at least one other addiction problem. So much so, I know you're gathering data on the reasons that become homeless. I really would ask your team to ask that as part of their questioning tenants. From your perspective, many people will present as homeless and will do so on more than one occasion. Early intervention could make a real difference to landlords, tenants and PCC alike. I know there are many issues, there are many things landlords get wrong, there are many things tenants get wrong, but if we're actually trying to solve the problem, that's a key starting point. At page 76, you give reasons for ending tenancy as rent arrears 18%, and I suspect this relates to Section 8 court hearings. No fault as 35%, and 29 as other, which if it's not arrears or no fault, I'm not sure what those things could be. But in my experience, we use Section 21 all too often as a way of gaining possession when the real underlying problem is rent arrears. And we know, as landlords, that when we use Section 21, we're more likely to get assistance from the council in getting the people moved on, bringing a tenancy to an end because they can be relocated. Thus, the true amount of arrears is probably masked. I've mentioned the English Landlords Survey. As an agent, I just want to say I represent 28 landlords, of whom 14 have a single property and 5 have between 2 and 4 properties. They make up 40% of my portfolio, and that's about the same as is the case throughout England. 4 of them are women in their 70s, 2 are widows, and 2 care for husbands with terminal illnesses, to name but a few. Another case, a landlord in his 60s was a carer for his late father, is in poor health himself, and has no other income at all except the rent he derives from one house. He always puts his tenants first. He has a reserve, and sadly I have to spend it for him from time to time. But in my former days on an NHS community team, I would regard all of those landlords as being competent people, but nevertheless having a high degree of economic vulnerability. Those people rely on that income for their pension, or more than 50% of their income in many cases, and they are entitled to have their story told. My approach is to make a case for a specialist housing mediation service. You used to have, was it Elaine Bastable doing mediation, or
the other one?
The other one. Eileen Baines, providing this service. I don't believe it's about anymore, but even so, I would like to see a specialist mediation service with trained mediators funded by Portsmouth City Council, and with those people having powers to refer to the courts as if necessary, where that could assist in disposing of the matter, even before court proceedings have begun. Given the very large and bewildering array of options that tenants have, I would like to encourage mediation. In fact, the courts themselves are very willing to work with mediation services. I've enclosed a link to the guidelines for county courts in using mediation services, and one of the biggest reasons they're not used is because the mediation services themselves are not there. They exist in Southampton, by the way. I don't want to get into any kind of city rivalry, but they have or had it in the past. And just to quote one paragraph from paragraph page 6 of that report, it says, while members of the judiciary have complete discretion on what to do in a case, research shows that mediation works best when there is some form of judicial encouragement, and that such encouragement can be quite robust. It can, of course, be quite robust from city councils as well. It doesn't require any great leap of faith into the unknown by the judiciary. In fact, it exists. It works well in other areas of law, such as employment, where we have ACAS, and it works extremely well in Canada, where problems can be addressed as little as after 10 days referring to their online alternative dispute resolution service. It is much, much faster.
And that is your 6 minutes, Alwyn.
Thank you very much for your time.
Not at all.
Must write less.
Something I know well. So thank you for that. Now, that's the formal deputations, but I think given the nature of what's been put forwards, I'm suggesting that we adopt a slightly more discussion-based approach with the people that we have here. I'm also conscious that Council spent 63 minutes talking about this last week, which both Cal and Scott were present for, and I wasn't, due to complications from surgery. I don't know who got off lightest, I really don't. Thank you very much, Scott. I didn't want to say that, but thank you very much indeed. So what I propose is to, because I'm interested in both the deputations, because some of what each of them have said have been things that have been burbling around in my head as well. What I suggest it's just to spend a little while talking on essentially 3 separate things, because I think there's 3 areas we're looking to cover here. The first is, what is the problem? Which I think is a large part of what Martin and Cal and others have been saying. The second is, are the options to be explored the right ones? And the third is, are there any others we've missed? An answer to which the question may be yes. So it'll be good to know initially from officers and then from the politicos, and also from our friends from the CLG, if they wish to take part, that would be great, where they think actually the problems lie. Claire, what is the problem that we're trying to face here? I think I know, but I would like your thoughts on it. I'm sure every politician thinks they know, because they spent an hour talking about it last week.
I think that we probably need to do some more work around really understanding the problems and gathering more information and more data. But I think, as is outlined in the report, it can be summarised as things like rent affordability and lack of security of tenure for some of those tenants, rent arrears and the issues around why that happens, as well as the conditions of properties. We know that we, in private sector housing, deal with issues around the conditions of the living conditions for tenants. And these are the broader issues that we're experiencing as well around rent arrears and affordability of rent.
Okay. Page 76 of the report. 29% of the reasons people present as homeless from private rental sector are short-hold tenancies, or the private sector, which is the biggest single reason why people come to us as homeless in the city, is other. What does that mean? If you don't know, say so.
I can hand over to my colleague Shane, who's able to give a bit more
Right,
information
lovely.
about that.
Yeah, other can mean a number of different things by definition. The categories we record as to the cause of homelessness from private sector are given to us as requirements from central government. So they reflect the data we return to central government. So within other would be all the things that don't fit those very specific criteria outlined alongside them. So it could be, for example, relationship breakdown between landlord and tenant when there's a maybe no breach of tenancy, but a relationship breaks down. It could be a situation where, so I'm trying to think of other specifics at the moment, but in essence, it's anything else. It also relies on the officers in question being able to make a judgment as to what's happened. Sometimes contact won't be able to be made with a landlord, or there'll be no definitive reason. So, frankly, some landlords or letting agents have told housing options in the past that they don't want to tell us the cause of eviction, and there's not much we can do to force them to do so.
Okay. Relationship breakdown, because that's exactly what breakdown between landlord and tenant. Sorry, I should do this. I apologise for behaving like Jacob Rees-Mogg. The landlord and tenant relationship breaking down, that's precisely what Alwyn was talking about. Is there some way in which we can? Are we able to record those figures? Because at the moment we've got with 30% of the biggest single reason by miles that people present as homeless, we ain't got a clue, which is a little worrying.
Yeah,
and you're saying government doesn't give us a clue?
No, so what I'm referring to is, so we at the moment, the data we record has just reflected what we've been asked to record for central government in that specific area. But discussions already started as to what else would be useful to know and how we could break other down so we could have a better data set going forward and really understand the problems. Okay. So those conversations started before today to understand what other is, and it may be that we have a better picture after some months of data.
I think that would be very useful for reasons that I'll come to at the end, so I will do the summing up of this section. I won't go back to the deputies because they've essentially given us an analysis of that. Cal, what do you think is the problem that we face? So I'll come back to our CLG colleagues in a second.
Deregulation. So the fact that over years and years and decade on decades, laws around housing regulation, etc., have been reduced down to quite a basic low level. And the question for me is, does the council have the skill, the kind of insights into the current regulation regime and how it enforces that? So a classic thing with landlord licensing that we talked about at the HMO governance board is, right, there's kind of statutory legal requirements around fire risk assessments or fire alarms or whatever. How is that monitored on an ongoing basis in properties that aren't licensed? I mean, in reality, it's not. We're dependent on there being an issue, it getting reported, us then looking into it. What licensing does is it takes a proactive response and saying, okay, you've got these legal requirements, you need to show us every year that you're actually fulfilling them. So I think there's quite a low kind of regulatory ability for the council to intervene in the private rented sector, but there are some powers, licensing being one of them, that we can do even within quite a restrictive national policy framework, and it seems to me we should be doing everything we can to drive up standards, and we should be kind of getting to it as soon as possible rather than kicking the can down the road.
Right. Do you think this document is kicking the can down the road?
Yes. The council has the power to start implementing the landlord licensing schemes now, but instead we're committed to looking at it, having a review, and then maybe kind of 3 months, 6 months further down the line starting that process, which is just putting the driving up standards in the private rented sector back. And there's tenants and residents that are relying on us to be doing all we can.
Right.
And I don't think we are doing that at the moment.
I want to come back to some of that because that deals with, are these the right solutions or not? But I want to come back to Claire and to Paul on this. It's purely around deregulation. There is nothing else. In your judgment and experience, is that reasonable? And if you can't say so, be useful. No?
No, I don't think it's just purely re-regulation. There's obviously market issues and demographics, a whole number of factors that would affect the private rental sector, not just deregulation.
Okay, it's fine, but I will hold some what Cal said earlier on and later on. Scott.
Thank you, Councillor Sanders. I'm going to go back to the points that Shane brought up first about the other section. But helpfully, you did email me last Wednesday what other meant. So if I can help you out a bit, it's where the relationship between landlord and tenant is broken down, where there's no breach of the tenancy, where landlord wants to remedy a neighbour dispute, but there's been no breach of the tenancy, and where there are works required in the property where the tenant cannot be in situ. So, and actually, very helpfully as well, you've put yourself down at the bottom. They can look at the fields you can actually put them in to actually look at the data. I think you made a real pertinent point actually about data and the manipulation of data and what we can do with it, because Darren's right fundamentally that the other section is the second highest element of what's causing a tenancy to end, and yet we don't actually know what other actually is, and we need to break that down a hell of a lot more. So I think that's a real good point that you've brought up. I'm just going to move on to a couple of bits in the report. Estimate or approximate, at the start of the report it says there's an estimate approximately 20,000 private rented homes. It's either one or the other. It's either an approximate or it's an estimate. You know, that's me being very, very pedantic, but it is a little bit misleading. If you go to the top of it, it is there. Then we're moving on. So I've got lots of little notes that I've made. Reasons for contacting private sector housing, and I think you can help me out with this, Claire. How long have we got the current data set? How old is that data set? Have we got any data that's preceding what we've got on the paper in Appendix 1?
Could you just refer me to which page you're looking at, please?
Okay, bear with me.
Scott, are you referring to page 76 of the report?
Pretty much, Darren, it's always pretty much the data, yeah.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So essentially it's a pie chart which outlines the reasons why
This is the one where we've talked about the other reasons as well. So
how old is that data set?
I'd have to refer you again to my colleague, Shane.
I can see on the top of the graph it says 1819, but these are statistics we report quarterly.
So if I was to go back to page 69, for example, and 68, and that data is showing me February 19 to July 19, and then August 18 to August 19, so that's only held for a year, and we've got one data for 6 months. Have we got any more data before that, or are we just holding data for 6 months to a year at a time? Because it would be pertinent. I'm just thinking for a holistic approach to actually see if there are any trends, if we've done anything differently, can we factor in any policy that we've changed, so we can actually factor in what the solution is to the problem that we're trying to identify.
So the data that you're referring to on pages 68 and 69 come from the private sector housing team, which is separate to the data that Shane's been explaining. And that was recorded in a different way prior to 2018. So we can collect data from prior to that, but because it came from a different system and it was recorded in a slightly different way, it's difficult to make direct comparisons to the data that we hold since that date.
Yeah, so fundamentally you're saying the data that we had previously would be effectively useless moving forward because it wouldn't tell us much of what we don't already know.
I'm not sure if it would be completely useless, but it just would be more difficult to compare it to the current data that we hold.
Okay, so in a roundabout way you are sort of saying that it's not worth using, Claire, which I think is the nicest way to put it, because I think fundamentally, I think Martin's actually quite right. This is quite a data-driven exercise, and I think you're going to have to get the data right before you push forward on any sort of policy, which was quite heartening actually for full council to vote through effectively the report that Darren's taken in today. So it was nice to have all parties signing up to that and voting on the substantive, which was very nice. I've got nothing else to add at the moment, Darren, but I think at the moment the biggest problem we've got is we're trying to identify a problem, and that's the problem.
Okay. Alwyn, I won't come back yet. Our CLG colleagues, do you have anything to say? I don't know whether you have experience of people you know who rent privately or what.
I apologize first if maybe I could say some words that it's not appropriate or acceptable.
There is no such thing as unacceptable, provided it's legal.
Yeah.
In this room.
I'm just thinking about, because I grew up in different country, and I grew up in a family very poor, and my parents are hardworking. So I think it also one of the issue that affects some of the young people or the grown-up people, that their attitudes or their way of thinking is not very clear enough, because maybe they grew up in a broken home or the father is irresponsible. And I'm happy that your government is very good. I have no complaint. That's why I'm here. But we are jumping into strategy that is hard to do it without doing also at the same time the right way for the parents who are how they will upbring their children and educate, so that they will have a good thinking of how to choose the good way of life. That is how you can improve your life like that in the future. Because everything is not working if you always keep helping. We have to also improve the parents' way of upbringing their children.
Okay.
I hope.
Thank you. Pete, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people I deal with. Oh, sorry.
Please put your microphone on, otherwise there's no way you'll ever be heard.
A lot of people I talk to and deal with, a lot of it is this universal credit, because they all have got housing problems. They all owe loads and loads of rent. Why they leave it up to them to pay £600-700 a month, it's beyond me, you know what I mean? I know Mark Fitchie said to me they can pay it. Why they don't? Because once you've got a roof over your head, you look after that, but they don't seem to grasp that. They just think, I'll leave it till next time. Next time never comes. That's a lot to do with all the rent apartment, what you were saying, Martin, It needs to be delved in, really. It needs to be looked at, and in connection with the government to say, or whoever it is, to say, them rents have got to be paid direct, come what may. And that will solve a lot of the landlords and the council's problems.
Thank you for that. Alvin, you wanted to come back.
Just on the point of the data set, now I don't mean to be critical of my colleagues who have done an excellent job, but I wonder if it's about the prism through which you look, because private sector housing, it seems to me, concentrate on looking at the problems with the property, as do many housing advisors, and the problem may relate to the tenancy or the relationship between parties. And that's why I believe that a mediated solution, a way of getting to grips with problems early on, is not a soft option on tenants, it's not a soft option on landlords. It might be a better option for the way we run the city. I do not ever want to be soft on landlords who provide poor housing. I may have a different approach to getting things up to standards because of the people I've known and met and worked with. But I remember when I worked 20 years ago in a Citizens Advice Bureau just round the corner from here, and started on my career as a landlord at more or less the same time. I very gingerly approached the senior housing advisor because I was having a problem with a tenant, and she said, "Owen dear, you don't do your tenants any favours by letting them build arrears." And that's why I believe in mediation. You don't do landlords any favours by letting problems in properties go unresolved year in, year out, whether it's damp condensation, the roof need fixing, or many other things, because ultimately that costs them. And the problem we have in this country is that the system is adversarial. And the advantage we have in Portsmouth is that we have a very good mediation service who preach restorative justice. And that's where I think we should be going. It's not a soft option.
Thank you for that, Alwyn. I think you've gone into practically every single option that's available to us at the moment. That's fine. Paul, and then I want to do some summing up, if I may.
I just want to pick up a specific point about the council do through Advice Portsmouth. So we do signpost tenants who might have tenancy issues to Advice Portsmouth, and they give advice to anyone in the private rental sector who has tenancy issues. So it's not something that we do specifically. No. I'm just picking up that point about supports for tenants.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for all that. That's been incredibly helpful. It's depends on what the question is, and I might be nice. You're going home early.
I would say, given the landlord lobby been able to speak more than me as an elected representative, I'll take my chance if you don't mind. It's just to get a bit of clarity, I guess, from officers about what the process would be. So at the moment we're talking about doing a review, and I think it's a really good idea to have a strategy around the private rented sector. Quite why we didn't have one before, I'm not too sure. But if the outcome of this review is that actually we do need to be looking at landlord licensing, or if it's selective licensing or additional licensing of HMOs, what is then the process from there, and any kind of indicative timescales we know of?
Thank you for that. Could you just hold that back? Because as I said at the start, there are three things I wanted to get through. The first is what the problem is, and see where we're taking us. The second is, are the solutions that are in this paper the right ones? And what you've suggested is one of the things that is in this paper, as it was in the council motion that you all voted for, because I wasn't there last week, but members of my party did vote for. And then the third is, are there any others, which I think is where Alwyn is coming from. So I would suggest you just hold that back for a second. It's my turn, and given politicians spent an hour last week talking about this, whilst I was on my sickbed, I'm more than happy to. I think the notion about evidence is really important. And I think what everybody is saying actually reinforces the approach that is being taken, which is not a let's go headlong into something without knowing what the evidence is. The quantitative evidence does need, I think, a bit more work, and I'm grateful that the officers have recognised that, and it looks like Shane might be going away and looking at a few more spreadsheets as a result. But also, I think from when I emailed all councillors to ask for their thoughts about the private rented sector, I got the grand total of nothing back, which I thought was interesting, because I thought, well, they clearly don't think it's an issue. I know these two think it's an issue, because they've told me, and that's great. But it did show a level of interest which I thought was less than the situation deserves. But I do think we do have to be driven by evidence. But there do seem to me to be some issues that we can tease out as we go along. And that's why I think this approach is welcome. The first is that, quite simply, there are too many people on our council house waiting list who would much rather stay there for years than go private. They're worried about the private rented sector. They're worried that the rents are too high. They're worried that there's insecurity. They're worried they'll be chucked out for no reason. All of the things that really concern them, and I'll come back to Pete's point about universal credit and housing benefit in a bit. There are too many people on that waiting list who are there for a long period of time. And when you say go private, they say no. So one issue is there a problem with the private rented sector? The next bit is that, frankly, most people who live in the private rented sector, according to all the evidence, have a reasonable experience. That's where all the national evidence comes from. And that is quite interesting. It's not everyone by any means, and there are some academic studies like the Centre for Housing Policy study which says that there is a minority of criminals, and they actually use that word, criminals, in there. So I think that there are some issues that we need to look at about breaking down the barriers because people, for whatever reasons, don't want to go private. There are issues around homelessness. And I don't want to stretch into the next bits, but it is the single biggest reason why people become statutorily homeless in this city. And we spend far too much, and their lives need to be much better. And one of the ways we can do that, I think, is to tackle this particular issue. And the truth is, some people who are already in the private rented sector are worried about poor property conditions. They're worried about security of tenure. That's precisely why they're here. So I think we have to be driven by the evidence. But part of the evidence as well is around those people on housing benefit and universal credit. And the truth is the National Landlord Survey 2018 says about half the most of the landlords don't want people on housing benefit, and about half the landlords don't want them on universal credit. That is not good. We cannot build our way out of a housing crisis. And so what we have to do is we have to take an approach that is based on the evidence, and that is a tailored approach for this city, given our housing market and given our housing needs. So I think the first thing is to say that we do need to be driven by evidence, but there may well be enough of a series of trends to operate some serious principles on which we need to be driven. And I think the first thing is that the evidence, of which I suspect there will be more, is the first thing that goes forwards, which is why we're not going headlong, Martin, into agreeing something today. The interesting thing is I don't think, and where I disagree with Cal, is that it is not purely a deregulation issue. Falling behind with your rent ain't going to be solved by a clipboard, it's going to be solved by a calculator, if we're honest. No fault evictions, which are being ended by this government, apparently, are something that, again, can't be solved by licensing or regulating your way out of it. A breakdown between a landlord and a tenant can't be organised by necessarily by licensing your way out of it. And that's why I think a more flexible approach, which all political groups in the council approved last week, would be a sensible way forward. I can't vouch for parenting classes, madam. I can't vouch for improving the parents. But I'm not sure whether we can offer. No. Thank you very much for putting that forward, because we need to be open with each other. But I'm not sure housing can provide parenting classes, but there may be other things we can provide later. So I think the first thing is to say that this is the right way forwards, but we're going to need a significant amount of evidence going forwards over the next few weeks, and that may have to be qualitative as well as quantitative, I think. So the next bit, I think, is around, are the options in this report the right ones? Can we remove any of them? So I'm going to go back to the report and outline what they are. One is called additional licensing of shared houses, which is exactly what Martin was referring to when I brought it in 6 years ago. One is the selective licensing of all private rented properties, which is what Cal was referring to earlier. The third is around targeted proactive inspections. The fourth is around accreditation. The fifth is around compulsory landlord registration. The sixth is around educating tenants. And the seventh is around help for housing associations. Officers, Claire, guide us through, if it can be guided through, or is it all self-explanatory?
I can give you a very brief overview of them. So additional licensing focuses on HMOs. We already license HMOs in the city that are occupied by 5 or more people. So additional licensing would focus on those that fall outside of that mandatory criteria, basically 3 or 4 residents in a HMO. Selective licensing is about licensing all privately rented properties, so moving the focus away from just HMOs. Targeted proactive inspections of certain areas in the city is really an alternative to licensing, so it's about focusing on those maybe smaller areas of the city that we might know that if the data tells us there are areas that need certain focus on. We have powers within the Housing Act already to do proactive inspections. The use of accreditation schemes. So we have an accreditation scheme that we already run in Portsmouth, but it might be that we could look at ways of expanding that scheme to provide additional support to both tenants and landlords, and probably with an educational focus as well. Compulsory landlord registration. This is something that has already been brought out in other areas of the UK, so for instance in Scotland, and it's something that is being considered as a compulsory thing to be introduced in England as well. Educating tenants around their rights and responsibilities, that really is self-explanatory, but it's about acknowledging that there are tenants that need extra support and landlords that need extra support, and the role that we could play in providing that support to them. And equally in helping housing associations in establishing maybe different protocols about how we would deal with complaints that we come across from residents of housing associations.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a question from me, Claire. With regards to the licensing bits, given that you've mentioned housing associations, it's surprising that you as a team dealing with private properties get complaints from housing associations, because I would have thought they'd have gone to their own landlords. Legally, can we licence them in the same way we might licence private landlords?
It doesn't work in the same way.
No. So the answer is no.
No.
Okay, that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much for that. I will go back to our deputies this time.
Can I just ask for a clarification? On targeted proactive, you, in the document and as you just stated, said geographical. My understanding is it needn't be geographical. You could, for example, target housing benefit tenants or tenants in properties where they pay for a housing benefit.
So we would have the flexibility to do inspections in the way that we, if we have evidence to show that there's a need for an inspection in a certain way, yes, that's possible.
Yeah. So you can target a sector rather than the geographic.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for that, Claire. That's hugely, hugely helpful. Our CLG colleagues. Yeah, if you don't want to, if there's nothing you feel you can add to earlier on, that's absolutely fine. No, that's absolutely fine.
Because I think what is good life in the future. Like that.
Okay.
I respect, but religion is not accepted here, so it's not.
As someone who went to a Catholic school, I can tell you religion's accepted in a fair few places down here. Young Pete.
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate what Cal was saying and this gentleman here, which is that the only trouble with the homeless is that they want to stay on the street. Not all of them, but the majority of them, especially if they've got animals. So I don't know how you're going to work that one out. Yeah.
I think that's something that Pete, that's something that we're looking at through our rough sleeper strategy, and I know it's something I've already raised with various council officers.
Nice one, thank you.
This time, Scott, what are your thoughts about any of the options that are available?
The options are quite interesting, Darren, to be fair. For example, we've just looked at and grabbed the report quickly. I'm looking at the Rent It Right scheme, and it's quite a good bit of the report, actually, that the scheme was relaunched in 2017, and the report makes light of the fact that we haven't used it to the best of our ability. And I think something like that as well, bringing landlords and the housing team closer together would be quite an important movement for us moving forward. I think it's a very good scheme, and the accreditation would be good for landlords as well. But also, about building a relationship with landlords, I think that's something that we need to do better with the private sector. But I want to fundamentally come back to a couple of points I've made. It's, for example, if we were to introduce selective licensing, how confident would the private sector housing team be if it was over 25% in getting Secretary of State approval? I mean, how confident would it be if it was happening now?
Is that a question you feel you
If you
can
don't
answer?
feel you can answer it, just send it to me a written answer. I'm quite happy.
Sorry, I don't know what you mean by
Basically, if we
now.
had to do selective licensing now, and it was going to happen now, and it was over 25%, would the private sector housing team be able to cope with it? And would you get Secretary of State approval?
The Secretary of State approval is for 20% or more.
That's what I said, if it was over that.
So I couldn't really say at this moment of time.
Would you be confident with that data set?
I'm not sure, if I'm honest. I think that there are certainly some data and statistics to support selective licensing, but whether it would be robust enough to get Secretary of State approval, I'm not sure at this stage. I think we'd really want to examine that, and part of that would be that we would need to do a public consultation anyway, so probably
I'm
some
going
more
to take
of
that
that.
as a no then. Obviously, you don't feel.
I would disagree with you, Scott. I think the words "don't know." I think
the term was. I don't feel it's robust enough. I think pretty much tells me that it's not robust enough. You know, so that's how I'm going to interpret it, Darren. I'm sorry, but
you feel it. Interpret it how you like. This is still a free country. They tell us.
Well, apparently not if you're the Speaker of the House of Commons. But obviously, that's what I'm going to take from that feedback. It's just it's an interesting point. You said that you don't feel it's robust enough, and I don't feel it's robust enough either. To be honest, I think data is at the heart of what we're trying to do here. It's very much what we know was on the report, Darren. It's nothing that I don't know. It's nothing that we don't know. It's nothing that Martin doesn't know. It's nothing that Alan doesn't know. Nothing that any of here doesn't know that we can do. Generally, I think we're dancing around houses on recommendations when really we need to get the facts of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and that's the fundamental issue.
Okay, thank you for that, Scott. Cal, you've been pressing for, you've mentioned various things previously. So just for clarification, when you've talked about selective licensing, where?
Well, from my argument would be that by starting the process, you can then look at the data and start that consultation to work out where it needs to be done. So you have got the option of doing it that covering less than 20% of the private rented sector properties within Portsmouth local authority, in which case you don't need to go for Secretary of State approval. Or if you want to go for a wider expanse, then you have to go for that approval. But if I could just go through, I've got a few questions on the report.
Cal, you've been very clear about what you want, so I need to be very clear. Do you think that the issues that lead to what you want apply in less than a fifth of the city, or more than a fifth of the city, or less than a fifth of the properties, or more than a fifth of the properties?
I think in general, all privately sector rental properties are under-regulated and not effectively monitored, and I think licensing schemes give local authorities more power to do that.
So the answer to my question, I'll give you full rein to do that in a second.
Okay. I didn't realise I was the
No. Well, no, you're not, but you have put this forward, and I've acknowledged what you've done right at the start of the meeting. So is the answer to my question yes?
What's your question?
Do you think that what you want merits Secretary of State approval?
I believe all landlords of privately rented sector properties should be more tightly regulated and more effectively monitored by local authorities, so yes.
Right. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I got the right answer.
Sit in that seat, I'm more than happy.
I'm delighted, but there's something called an election that always needs to get in the way. Now you have got total unfettered...
If I may.
Hang on, Scott. You'll come back once Cal has finished.
Okay, thank you.
It sounds like a rerun of last week from what I got told.
So the recommendation talks, 2.3 talks about undertaking an informal consultation. If we do this review and then we decide that actually we do want to pursue selective licensing or additional licensing, then we'd have to undertake further formal consultation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so I guess my concern there around kind of resources and use of time is that we're potentially doubling up unnecessarily when we could be starting that formal consultation now. In terms of running through the options, so targeted proactive inspections, do we do that at the moment, or are we proposing that as a new policy for the council?
We're not proposing any of this, actually. I think that's probably a point to make, that this is about putting in a strategy, and these are some of the things that could come out of that strategy. We have done proactive inspections intermittently when we've identified that they're required. So that is something that we have always done for a number of years, and we would continue to do.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going through... So, I mean, just to address some of the issues Darren was asking around housing associations. I mean, housing associations are already regulated, aren't they, on a national level? So effectively they are licensed, and if they don't meet certain standards, then they can have that. They might not call it a license, but that could be withdrawn if they're not meeting certain standards. So I guess what we're potentially talking about when we're talking about private sector landlord licensing is kind of raising that oversight to the same level that already applies to social housing. And in terms of so targeted, that's the thing with selective licensing, it can be targeted. So you could choose, for example, a particular ward or a particular set of wards where you think there are particular issues around the private rented sector and target that selective licensing scheme on those. In general, I mean, our argument has always been, this is why we've decided to campaign on this issue, is every time we go out door knocking in in areas where there are concentrations of privately rented properties, people are raising these issues. And that's why I found it surprising at full council and kind of again where it's been mentioned today that some councillors and decision makers are unsure that there are issues there. I think all you need to do is go out and door knock in those particular areas to pick that up. So I very much welcome the report. I think it's a shame we're not making a decision now to pursue selective and additional licensing, and just pushing it further down the line when it could be done much sooner. Just to kind of finish up, go back to my original question on this, what would then happen? So say we come back with this report in 3 or 6 months, and the recommendation of that report or an option is to start implementing selective licensing or additional licensing. What would the process then be, if you've got any idea around kind of indicative timelines?
I think it's difficult for me to say at this stage what the timelines would be, but the process is fairly prescriptive in terms of what the legislation says we would need to do to bring in selective licensing, and that's very much about gathering sufficient evidence, having a formal consultation, and whether or not we would have to apply for Secretary of State approval. So it's difficult for me to say what the timescales would be on that.
Okay. Was that your...
Yeah.
Thank you. I told you I'd give you unfettered access. Scott, you wanted to come back on something?
Just a couple of points, actually, that
And then I'll try and sum
Councillor
up.
Corkery actually brought up. He says about particular areas of the city. But you didn't actually identify those areas. Can you just identify the areas of the city that you think that would be an important policy to implement, and where? Because it's good you say in particular areas, Cal, but if we're going to do this correctly and you want to put it down on record, where do you think that selective licensing would actually be implemented? Because it'll just go factor into the officer's report.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So the areas that I've spent a lot of time kind of door knocking and engaging with residents are around particular areas in Fratton and Southsea where there's high concentrations of HMOs and privately rented properties, and people feel that that's having a significant impact on the local community, and people on the doorstep are saying to us, why isn't the council doing more to kind of regulate the private rented sector, make sure that landlords are held to an account and providing accommodation and managing properties to a decent standard?
Okay, thank you, Cal. And the second point is, I noticed there's a little bit of competition between you guys, and you offered to sit in Councillor Sanders' chair, when it was your party that put Councillor Sanders in that chair. So if you're not happy, you can remove him.
Cal, I think Cal, we both got beards. Scott, I think that's more of a political point than anything else, I think. No, that's absolutely fine. It's still free country. If I may, I'd just like to ask a couple of questions. Two places keep getting mentioned around various things. One is Newham and one is Brighton. Could officers explain a bit more about what they understand? Because Newham was in the council motion as discussed last week. Could officers be able to understand anything they have picked up around Newham, which is cited as the place where all of what Cal is saying has been working? Are officers able to do that?
Yeah, we haven't gone into in-depth studies as to particularly what happened in Newham, but from what I understand, Newham had a particular issue with crime in their borough, and that was one of the drivers, and they identified that crime was linked to some private rental properties, so they decided to use selective licensing as a way of finding where those properties were to deal with crime. So they had very much a specific reason for going down that route, and as with all the other options and places that they've been brought in, they will have been brought in for specific reasons that were relevant to those areas. So yeah, that's what we know about Newham at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. Landlords. Martin, I'm so glad you're booking in your orders already. This is excellent news. That's super. So, Brighton. My understanding of the situation in Brighton was that they did what Cal is suggesting, and then landlords took them to court.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I wasn't actually placing orders. I was trying to check which one got rejected last week. I think it was Hounslow, but I didn't manage to confirm.
Right.
There was another one that came through. I think the issue with all of them was there's just a lack of evidence. There was a whole body of evidence saying this is what it's like. There was nothing actually identifying a specific problem that additional licensing or selective licensing would fix. And generically, that's what we see every time these things come up and then get shot down.
Okay, so essentially what my reading of the Brighton case was, they didn't have enough evidence. They didn't do enough consultation. They did it quickly when authorities that seemed to do it have done it for 12 to 18 months and usually spent that sort of period of time doing it. And then they got done in the courts, which means nothing happens.
Yep.
Similarly with Newham, because this is not a once-off and then nothing happens process. You have to renew everything every 5 years, which takes a lot of time, and that's one of the things that's come up from the academic research that's been done. Is they spent 3 months without any licensing scheme at all, because they were waiting for the Secretary of State to have approval, which was around December 2016, December 2017, I think that was. I'm getting nods from the other end.
I'd agree that any form of licensing is not a quick solution. You're far better off using powers already there under the Housing Act and going in and targeting where you see the problems rather than trying to bring in a licensing solution.
Okay.
On Newham, I think I've said it before, how they allowed it to get so bad before they decided to enforce. Total lack of enforcement for 10 years until they had beds in sheds and all of those problems. And I know you thought I was being racist when I made a deputation and quoted some facts and figures, but unfortunately they've got a demographic there which is different to what we have here, and in Newham they've just got completely out of control and they needed licensing to try and bring it back in order, but if they'd enforced from the beginning they would never have had the problem.
Thank you for that, Martin. It's my turn, I think, and I think the issue here around what the options are, I don't think we're in a position yet because of the evidence to drop anything at the moment. But I think what going forwards, the strategy needs to work on the basis of the stick versus the carrot and the balance between the two. And I think we need to find more evidence to see what the balance is between the two. The interesting thing when listening to discussions around licensing is what the evidence actually says. So the independent review into selective licensing of July 2019 says that if it's done on its own, which is what I think Labour has been suggesting in the past certainly, it's very limited in terms of its success. It needs to work in, if it does happen, it needs to work within broad-based community measures. I think that's paragraph 9 of said review. And that it doesn't deal with some of the issues that people raise. So paragraph 12 on page 9 of this review talks about poor property conditions, which is one of the things I know many of the deputations to council gave previously. That's not a condition of the licence, and it can't be. And councils that actually have that scheme say that's one of the biggest barriers to it. Even if they like it, it's one of the biggest barriers to it. And all parties on the council, including both Labour and Conservatives, agreed that poor property conditions and rent arrears should be principles we take forwards. So I think going forwards, there is a balance of the carrot and the stick. I disagree with what Cal is saying with regards to we should implement the licensing now and why we actually worrying about talking to people, because I think it's important we do talk to people, otherwise we are going to wind up like Brighton. We're going to wind up in court, because you guys are going to take us to court, and you guys may win. And I don't think that actually helps the people who I speak to in Somerstown and in Fratton and in my ward and in North End and in Eastney and in Southsea, who desperately want things to be better. They do want it to be better, but if you tell them, oh, by the way, if you go down this route, it won't be better because we'll be in court, that may not be a sensible way forwards. And I think, again, that reinforces the sense of actually a proper strategy as opposed to just being a one-club golfer, I think. So again, officers, I take away the idea of actually a balanced approach, but as part of the strategy maybe analysing the balance between the stick versus the carrot. I do not pretend that landlords are philanthropists. They're people, many of whom do a good job, some don't, who are business people. And that's how we should be treating it. So again, it's the balance of the stick versus the carrot. The final thing, I think, before we go to conclusions, I think is what else do we need to do? Alwyn, you've talked about housing courts, effectively, which is Liberal Democrat policy. You call it mediation, but it's an independent way of redressing the power relationship that exists. And I would certainly be very, very interested to find out more details about this, to take it forwards. Various other things have been put forwards in various academic evidence, some of which you refer to in this paper. Officers as a whole, do you think there's anything else based on the evidence that you see that you think we should look at? You're allowed to say no, don't worry. So it's making it like call my bluff here.
I think from the discussion, or rather looking at the report, in 6.2 we talk about looking at what other areas are doing. So very naturally we will reach out to officers and other councils to probe them for good practice, including Newham, Brighton and so on. So if there's lessons we can learn from them, we will do so. And in terms of the mediation suggestion, which isn't part of the report, again, we'll be very interested in working with the associations. I think the whole point here is, assuming the recommendations are agreed, the idea of the consultation is to draw in all of those ideas as well. So we will naturally consider all of that before presenting it back to you for decision.
That's very kind, James. Thank you very much. Alwyn and Martin, was there anything else you wanted to add to the mix in terms of all this?
Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. You can't do something like mediation in 6 minutes. I'd love to work with councillors and explain, and officers, and explain it better. I think you have to look beyond the United Kingdom, because a lot of the United Kingdom is stuck in the same problem, or England at least. Wales have a slightly different approach. Scotland have changed their courts completely and got rid of Section 21 and clogged up all their courts and realised they need specialist courts. Canada have a much faster way of doing things, particularly British Columbia, where one of my former members of staff now works. So I discovered that by accident. But to know that a tenant could go to a court and request alternative dispute resolution online, and if the landlord hasn't acted within 10 days, be into the court system to deal with it, with the ability to make a compulsory order, and therefore anyone interfering with that tenant, by the way, would be in contempt of court. And for a landlord who's suffering, as one of my landlords has somebody who's dug their heels in and not paying rent, for that situation to drag on until a judge finally says, yes, they have to go. Both of those things are unacceptable. Both of those things are done better elsewhere. You do have to look beyond England. I've put some links in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alwyn. Martin, if it's brief, it will be lovely.
Just briefly, I think you've got a very good list of options. I reiterate, you really need to define what it is you're trying to solve before you jump into the options. Olwen's added mediation. Someone mentioned rent it right, which isn't clearly there, but there is a role for it, so don't lose it. And Southampton used to, and I don't know whether they still do, have a triage system. When stuff came in, the first thing they do was pick up the phone to both parties and try and work out what was really going on, whereas the Portsmouth solution was always to send someone in and do an HHSRS, which was always confrontational and assuming blame rather than trying to work out what the problem was. So maybe that's a step towards where Olwen wants to go. Maybe it's something else, but don't lose that one, because it worked very well in Southampton.
That's kind. Thank you very much. Cal?
Just to kind of reiterate the point, I think that I am concerned, and we are concerned, that this report is just pushing landlord licensing further down the line. We believe that there is a strong case for making that decision now, rather than making it in 3 months or 6 months' time, because there's a lot of people out there in the private rented sector that are being treated unfairly, that are having to live in poor conditions, and the council should be doing everything within its power to improve their lives.
I'll come back to all these points in a second. Scott?
Thank you, Chair. No, I think fundamentally the report outlines a decision we made at full council with the notice of motion that was cross-party. It's a very sensible report. It actually gives us effectively a means to build on and make the correct decisions down the line, and to make decisions that will not financially cause the council any concerns. I think with your blessing this report goes through, Chair, and I think it's quite sensible the route you're taking, especially that you have the blessing of the 22 councillors that were left in the room.
I think it was 21 without me, or people just gave up the will to live because it was 8 o'clock at night. I think, if I may, colleagues, I'll use this opportunity to sum up, because it's now 5:45 and I think we all want to get home before 9 o'clock, again, for some councillors. I think there are many issues affecting people who rent privately. And I think part of the problem is that there is no one solution. It's with many things, there is no one solution. We could do what our Labour colleagues originally wanted us to do, but then withdrew, and instead voted for essentially this approach, as did our Conservative, Liberal Democrat and Progressive colleagues last week, which is to this approach, based around dealing with poor property conditions, based around dealing with rent arrears, based around dealing with evidence. All my reading of the evidence is that if you go down one route, the licensing route, you ain't going to deal with people who have rent arrears. You ain't going to deal with poor property conditions, and that is what people are crying out for when I talk to people across the city, not purely in Fratton and Southsea, but in Somers Town as well. And that requires a proper strategy. It is pointless going down a route only to be sued, as happened in Brighton, months later, and then nothing happens. That is nuts. And I think we as a city deserve a Portsmouth-based solution, which may or may not include a form of licensing. Now, Martin said something about being a malign influence, which I think is going to come up in a bit earlier on. But I think our role is to try and make sure that we provide the best possible deal for people who are not just renting privately, but who are scared about renting privately. We as an administration have already done a lot. We've expanded Rent It Right by offering incentives, particularly to the vulnerable people who many landlords don't want to touch because of housing benefit and universal credit. We're already building more properties at Southsea Community Centre and Doyle Avenue and elsewhere, I think, for those sorts of people. We're already making sure that we can issue fines, powers that existed years ago, to make sure that people who live in shared houses understand their responsibilities that they have. So we're already doing a lot. But we can't be a one-club golfer. We need to do things on the basis of evidence, not just of our own theories. Much though I would love to do everything on the basis of my own theories, because it'll be a damn sight quicker, and it'll be wrong for the people of this city, because people in this city deserve better. People in this city deserve solutions that are actually quite ambitious. I totally agree with Cal's diagnosis of the situation. But his problem is he's looking at it he's not being ambitious enough. It's not purely around regulation. That doesn't deal with things like rent arrears. It doesn't deal with things like poor property conditions. We need to have a package that deals with everyone and everybody's conditions, and that is based on the evidence. And going ahead with something now, which may take 12 or 18 months anyway to do, seems to me to be the wrong way forwards. This seems to be the right way forwards. And the key thing is also to involve people. The sad thing is that we haven't got tenants here. We haven't got normal human beings here who are neither tenants nor landlords. And that's a real shame, and I hope we can work with the news and other media outlets to try and make sure that we can actually spread this informal consultation that we're doing as far as we can. Because we need their evidence. Because sometimes it feels like we're dealing with thin air in some cases. We've got a very organised landlords lobby who clearly hate some of what we're doing. But where are the tenants? Where are other people? And we want them involved because we want to make sure it's right for them, rather than just go ahead with something that may suit a certain route but may not be backed up by the evidence. So I pick up the first thing is we need more evidence and more detailed evidence, but be realistic, clear about where it is and where our limitations are. The second is to pursue a strategy, and I notice you have a deadline of the 1st of December, I think, in the as a closing date in the report. I'd be incredibly grateful if that were extended to the 15th of December to give people more time to do things, not to the 22nd or 23rd because it's Christmas, but I think an extension there would be hugely helpful. I think the third thing is to remember the principles that everybody, including Cal and Scott, agreed to last week, which are the principles in that council motion, which means anything has to do with poor property conditions, anything has to do with rent arrears, which I think is one of the weaknesses of the licensing-only approach. And the third thing is to get on strategy, based around realistic timetables, realistic milestones, what can be done in the short term, what can be done in the medium term, what can be done in the long term. And then I think we can do something that actually is worth this city and will be good for this city. And if it takes a while to get it right, then that'll be useful for everyone. I think we may have an argument about what we now call the B word amongst politicians, which seems to have been rushed rather than right. I don't want that happening because people in this city deserve better. So on that basis, colleagues, I'm happy to agree to the recommendations as putting forward, and I hope we can come forward with a strategy. I said early in 2020, you say early in 2020, the earlier the better, as far as I'm concerned, but I'm not expecting anything on the 1st of January. And then we can work to try and do something that's good for everyone. So thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you very much, officers, for that. That's a very good report. I now move to the homelessness strategy, and I understand that, Martin, this is where we become, or I become malign, I believe. Oh, sorry, no, I apologise. Who is going to introduce this report? Paul. I do apologise, Martin. You'll have your criticisms of me in about 2 minutes, I think.
Thank you. The purpose of this report is to present the updated final homelessness strategy, which outlines the city's preventative approach to understanding and responding to customers and residents who face homelessness. The background to this document is that there is a requirement on authorities to have a homelessness strategy, and that is laid out within the legislative requirements. We did previously have a homelessness strategy that ended some years ago, and with the Homelessness Reduction Act coming in 2017, and with the additional duties that came around that, we recognised that we needed to have that strategy back in place. We brought a draft to you at the beginning of the year. Following that, we went out to consultation for 3 months. And we considered the responses, built that into an updated version. We've also taken it to the Health and Wellbeing Board for their overview, and we bring this final here for you now to oversee. Homelessness impacts on all Portsmouth residents in lots of different ways, and between April 2016 and March 2018 we had just over 2,300 homelessness applications, and as stated in this report, almost 50% resulting from private rental tenancy ending. We've also seen a significant rise in rough sleeping, and last year we brought forward the street homelessness and rough sleeping strategy that runs from 2018 to 2020, and that was agreed last year. We've also recognised within this report that the requirement for the statutory requirement for a rough sleeping strategy has been indicated, and if that becomes the case, then it would make sense that we bring both homelessness and rough sleeping strategies together into a single strategy at some point in the future, probably in 2020. So just moving on, bear with me. So the strategy itself is there as the appendix. What we focus on is the accommodation first, not accommodation only model, which was also outlined within the in the street homelessness and rough sleeping strategy, and that informs the way that we build this strategy. And we've identified 5 key aims: preventing homelessness, reducing rough sleeping, relieving homelessness, sustaining tenancies, and then how we direct that strategy. And from that, we've identified 15 action points which are outlined within 6.4 of the report, and with those we have put indicative timescales. Some of those are ongoing and will continue. Some of those are pieces of work yet to begin, or limited, or pieces of work which are project to begin, and we hope to end as indicated. The final recommendation is that the Council endorses this homelessness strategy, which officially would run from 2018 to 2023, but as I've said, we may look in shorter than that to bring that with a rough sleeping strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Martin.
Thank you. Can I start by saying I commend what you've written, and thank you for taking on board the input that we gave you as you developed it, and it's fairly comprehensive. Darren, you cited earlier that much of the homelessness in the city is caused by private sector tenancies ending, which was supported by the previous discussion. I have two issues. The first is that some of the actions of the PCC are actually increasing homelessness. And the second is that the strategy you've got is very dependent on the goodwill of landlords. That list of actions at the end, more than half relate to landlords. And I fear you're losing the goodwill of landlords. So I can take those two briefly and quickly. PCC actions increasing homelessness. When the small room, 6.51 square metres minimum bedroom size came in, you had no choice but to implement that, and it was a sensible thing to do because most bedrooms that were smaller than that weren't big enough to be used as a living accommodation room. However, that lost the city 100 rooms, 150 in our estimation. When you then look at communal space, 6 years ago, houses with 5 bedrooms, which were at or near 10 square metres each, were approved as long as they had a reasonable kitchen and no communal space. Now, you need to give up a good-sized bedroom in one of those houses in order to provide enough communal space to meet the needs. This fundamental change was without any consultation or without any policy directives that we're aware of. And yet we were told by one of Claire's officers that he was aware of 150 properties that he'd reduced from 5 to 4 bedrooms. Implied it was to get it out of licensing and save him work, but whether it was or not, it doesn't matter. If the number is 150, and I suspect it's higher because this was 4 months ago, and we've seen many cases since, if it's 150, that's not 150 less rooms in the city. It's 750 probably affordable rooms being reduced to 600 probably unaffordable rooms. So that's a major impact. So I'm wholly with Cal that we shouldn't have poor standards in houses, but does a living room with room for a sideboard actually constitute poor standards, or not having a sideboard being poor standards? Because what you're doing is pushing up the cost of housing in the city and thus increasing homelessness. So that's my logic there. I can give you examples. Saw one this morning in Stamshaw. The landlord currently averages £386 per month per room for his 5 bedrooms. When he goes down to 4 early next year, he's told me what he's put in the rents to balance it out, and it's basically £70 a room more. So the one that's 320 disappears, and the average becomes 456. So standards are necessary, but there's a balance there. And what we're seeing at the moment is standards is the only thing anyone's focused on, and no one's aware of the impact, for example, on homelessness in the city. And it's a major impact. There's a lot of people finding they can't afford houses in the city, and part of that is being driven by the HHSRS rigid enforcement of standards. Doesn't matter what it is. And that is also what's driving the loss of goodwill to landlords. The number of small wash basins that have been changed in the city, I have lost count of. We were keeping track and we just stopped because there are just so many. Typical example, you've got a house that meets every single requirement in the standards, big bedrooms, large bathrooms, and in addition there's an ensuite. And the ensuite is next door. It's in the room, but if you go out the room, there's a communal bathroom next to it, and the ensuite has a small wash basin. And yeah, it's probably perfectly adequate for washing your hands when you've used the toilet, and if you want to do more, there's a shower right next to it. I've got numerous examples where someone's been told it has to be 600 by 700, and that's probably a misunderstanding on the landlord's part, because that's the building regs specified space for such a thing. It doesn't say how big it needs to be, but the number of people had changed where, from all intents and purposes, it fits, and changing those things pushes up the rent. It pushes people out of affordable housing. So, and it also loses the goodwill of landlords. So lots of examples: internal shower rooms surrounded by rooms with central heating, now being told to put central heating in. All these things are costs, and these costs come through. So apart from losing goodwill, because most landlords I talk to are really worried about any form of inspection now, and finding landlords willing to challenge it. And, we've got appeal processes, but everyone feels like the response of appealing is now vindictive because everyone who appealed last time has been re-inspected at least once since, even though their properties have been seen multiple times. So there's a real feeling of discomfort in the landlord community, and PCC need to address that. Otherwise, you're going to carry on increasing homelessness in your own stock. Thank you.
Apologies from getting up from my seat, Martin. That wasn't because of what you were saying, it's just I didn't know how long you'd lasted. But I think you came in under the 6 minutes, is that right, Jess? So that's the reason I came up from my seat. Now, you've made a whole series of things in there which directly involve Claire's team, and I think it was only fair that Claire is given the chance to respond to some of those. I may respond to a few of them later on, I don't know. But Claire, I think it's only fair, particularly, I will take out the more specific accusations that were in there about individuals, but I think, do you have any response to that?
I'll just give a very brief response. I mean, the rule around the 6.51 metres squared, I couldn't say how many bedrooms that's reduced in the city, but that is a statutory national standard. That's nothing to do with local policy. The estimate that you've given of 150 cases and likely more that have been affected by the communal space standards issues is incorrect. I couldn't tell you the exact number, but it's somewhere in the region of 30 to 40 properties. And I would just say that that only affects HMOs. This is only specific to mandatory HMO licensing that we're talking about. And the last point you made about suggesting that officers have been doing inspections in a vindictive way, that's again entirely related to licensing of HMOs.
Can I just, I hoped I didn't say they were vindictive. I was trying to say the perception is they're vindictive.
I fear that's how it
accept that.
Apologies, Martin, I fear that is how it came across, and intentional or not, that is how it came across. And we want to try and have a civil discussion even where we disagree.
Absolutely. I think it's probably just important to state that in those cases, though the properties were given a licence for a maximum of 1 year, and the reason that they've been inspected is because it has to be inspected during the licensing period, and that's been explained to all of the landlords affected by that, which is a very small number for landlords, I think. So I do hope that they understand that that's not in a vindictive way. It's because that has to happen as part of the licensing process.
That's fine. Martin mentioned things like space standards and stuff like that. Have they changed over the years?
No, so this is something that Martin and I have discussed on a few occasions, and the standards for HMOs were introduced in a document in 2013. That document was updated in 2018 to try to provide clarity, because some landlords had fed back that it wasn't particularly clear. But there was no actual material change to the standards in those two documents. But I know that Martin and I have discussed that, and that we don't necessarily come to an agreement on that at all.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you for that. I think we've strayed a fair bit off the topic, I think. And there are some issues that may need to be taken away. And I may need to come back to some of those in a tad. And I don't know how long a tad is, unlike airplane. Scott.
It's a very good report, Councillor Sanders, I have to admit. Part 3 is something that I've spoken to, I think, James about quite a bit, actually, about reducing the use of B&Bs, and I think I spoke to Wayne about this as well, about the cost of B&Bs in temporary accommodation that the city has to pay out at the moment, and I'm glad to see it's part of the strategy. What I will say, have the council looked into actually purchasing some B&Bs to actually offset the cost? It's more of a question for you, actually, I think, to be fair.
I'm very interested in all conceivable options. I don't know. And I think I'm certainly interested in trying to make sure we have all available options, and I think as part of that, if that needs to be looked at, that needs to be looked at. And if the strategy goes through today, frankly, that'll help a great deal.
Yeah, I just think looking at the costs that we spend out on Premier Inns, travel lodges, holiday inns, or you can book your hotels anywhere else you'd like to, actually, while we're actually on TV. I think it's quite sensible that we can actually estimate the cost between booking temporary accommodation and actually purchasing a property that would actually can house people that are homeless. I think it's a much more sensible longer term strategy than fundamentally spending a lot of money along the way.
I will come. You've touched on a couple of other things, Scott,
it's an
and
idea.
I will come back to that at some stage in my final remarks. Thank you for that, Scott. Cal?
Thank you. Just before I get into the kind of specifics of the homelessness strategy, I thought it was quite interesting to hear from the deputation that the hard work officers are doing of holding landlords and properties that are licensed to account, ensuring there are decent and safe standards. And maybe that's just another argument for extending that licensing, but I'll leave it there. In terms of the actual document we've got before us, I've got no issues with any of the content. Like it's aspiration, obviously. This is an aspiration to reduce and end homelessness. So there's no reason to disagree with any of that, and I actually endorse its contents. Just a few kind of specifics in terms of stuff that's come to my attention, both as a ward councillor and the opposition spokesperson for housing, around homelessness. So one issue here, and again this won't be a major shock to people I'm sure, is around the night shelter capacity. So it's definitely a major development for us to have the night shelter resource, which previously we didn't. But for quite a long time it was being said that, well, the night shelter always has capacity. Every night there's always a couple of beds if people, from certain people, I'm not saying yourself, but certain people were making this argument. And I think in recent times that's proven not to be the case. And my understanding is it now does regularly meet the capacity and are people that are turned away. So that's just something to bear in mind going forwards. Another kind of again, issue I'd just like to flag is that I know that there are a significant number of people who regularly use the night shelter, also people that don't use the night shelter, that have never actually had a formal homelessness decision from the local authority. And it may be because those people have rightly assumed that there wouldn't be a duty to house them, or it may be because by definition they're in one of the most hardest reached groups there are. But I definitely think there's potentially a bit more work to be done around ensuring that we are effectively reaching out to all those people and ensuring that their needs and their priority is properly assessed. And then around temporary accommodation, I know that at any one point in time, and this is something that I've had casework around, we've got families living in temporary accommodation, and a lot of them are living there for significant periods of time. My understanding is that there is a kind of legal 6-week limit that is at times breached by the local authority. So just whether you've got kind of any understanding of that. And I know we tried to raise this at the last full council, but unfortunately, obviously you weren't able to be there for good reason. So it's just really to flag those issues, endorse the report. Obviously there's kind of more work still to be done going forwards.
Okay. Thank you for that, Cal. I'm happy to answer a couple of those points and also a couple of Scott's points and sum up. I'm grateful to Conservative and Labour colleagues for their support for this strategy. I think it is very, very helpful. I think it's just the latest phase. As an administration, when we took over or we resumed in May 2018, bear in mind we had no statutory homelessness strategy. We had one when we last had power, but apparently it was so good we didn't need another one. Which was a crying shame, frankly. And then the Homelessness Reduction Act made sure that we did have to have one. So I'm delighted it's here. I'm delighted it's gone out for consultation. And I'm delighted we've taken on board many, many issues. I'll start with your points, Cal. You've actually raised, I mean, firstly, the issues that you raised are issues that I have also raised with officers, as far as the night shelters are concerned, frequently and often. And I'm looking forward to answers very soon on that, again based on demand. That's the key thing. All of this is based around evidence, not dogma. And when the evidence says there may be an issue, that is when I'm highly interested. And I have asked officers about this as far as night shelters are concerned. But you raised the point that many people have, which is people don't see the difference between this, which is for people we have a legal duty to house who are homeless, and rough sleepers, for whom I believe wrongly we have no legal duty, but we have a moral duty, and that is something we do intend to do, and that's why we've continued and we want to develop and grow the night shelters and all aspects of the homelessness service as we go along. But that's also why we've done a lot of work actually already in terms of dealing with it. You mentioned about the B&Bs earlier on, I think, Scott, and that's why we're very keen to buy homes for our homeless, both for rough sleepers and for people in temporary accommodation, because they deserve it. That's why we're working with charities like Hope Into Action, for instance, who offer a different approach, as well as with the Roberts Centre and other organisations, to try and get people back on their feet, because that's the key thing. If people want to get back on their feet, then they should be able to do so. And I think the issues for me are really simple. Are the numbers too high? Yes, they are, of people in temporary accommodation, because one is too high. The Homelessness Reduction Act gave councils the power to do something, but not the cash. Something that is a frequent complaint of all parties in local government, and the officers have done a fantastic job in trying to deal with the situation that we've got. A lot has already been done. A lot of it you actually voted for last week in the council motion, because a fair bit of it is in here. But we do need to do more, and that's why the strategy is essential. I would also commend the work that's been done working with the Assistant Police and Crime Commissioner, particularly around survivors of domestic abuse, and I look forward to that work growing and developing. And that's why it's important now, not just to have a panic response, but as with the private rented sector, an integrated strategy, integrated with rough sleeping. So the sort of things you mentioned about rough sleepers go together. And that's what I want, and I'm delighted that the officers are interested in that as well. I also would relay back some of the points, as Martin has mentioned earlier on, which do relate to the private rented sector. Now, as someone who believes that one of the main reasons that landlords have been panicking is over the various Conservative government tax changes, which have made life very, very difficult for landlords, it is no surprise that therefore even a small change actually creates a problem, and I understand that. I also understand that some of the issues you've raised have been dealt with at tribunals and stuff like that, and we do actually want to make sure that our space standards are good, because people do want homes, but they don't want to live in pokey holes. And I think too, you hear a case of a private company in Harlow, which has built a huge tower block, or bought a huge tower block, to build pokey holes for people in temporary accommodation. That is not good enough, and I'm delighted that we're not working with those companies. I'm delighted that we're doing a better way forwards. But we do have to cut the B&B bill. 900 quid a week has been quoted to me as some figures, and that is not acceptable, especially when you've got no kitchen. You can't cook for the kids. We need a better way forwards. We've started that through things like buying homes for our homeless, through things like offering landlords incentives to take in people who they might not otherwise take, but we have to go further, and that is why this strategy is very, very welcome, and some of it may overlap with some of the work we did earlier, I think, in those points. And so on that basis, and I'm delighted with that unanimous support, that I agree the outlining strategy, but with one proviso, which is that it's very important that we deal with the short, the medium, and the long-term actions. I've had emails from people going, well, half of this you're doing already. This is great news. And I'd be incredibly grateful if, as part of the minutes of the next meeting, officer colleagues, that the 15 points in here are put into short, medium, and long-term priorities. Short, I don't mean necessarily days, but definitely priorities, so we have got real milestones, real timetables, and real objectives, because that's what people want. They don't just want something that's another strategy that sits on a shelf. We want things that are done. And I think some of the issues you raised, Martin, around other aspects which are a bit tangential to this, I think can be raised elsewhere. But I will go, as I've told you more than once, with what tribunals tell me. If you want to go back and say they're wrong, happily do so, and we may even have a best of three. But I think it's important that we make sure that we go forward on the basis of what the standards are, and make sure that people actually live not just in homes, but in homes that are good enough, because pokey holes like they have in Harlow ain't good enough for people who want a better life. So on that basis, I agree with that. Colleagues, Mr. Fielding, thank you very much. Martin and Alwyn, thank you very much. You can stay if you wish. It is now 6:15. Cal can now go. So safe trip home, sir. Have a good tea. Over 2 meetings, right, okay, lovely. Well, have a good tea at some stage in the 2 meetings or afterwards, Cal, but definitely have a safe trip to your next place. And on that basis, I think we move to the tenancy strategy. Who wishes to deal with it? Mark, I believe it is you. Colleagues, thank you very much, and all three of you have a safe trip home. Mark.
Thank you. The purpose of the report is to present the updated Portsmouth City Council tenancy strategy, which outlines the council's approach to tenancy used by itself and registered provider partners in social and affordable rented properties. Registered providers, RPs, are organisations that act as a landlord to provide social and affordable housing and are also known as housing associations. There are a number of registered providers who provide social and affordable housing in Portsmouth, and the council itself is a registered provider because it's retained its own housing stock. Most of the registered providers offer the council nomination rights to their new and empty properties via letting agreements, and these properties are allocated via the council's central housing register in line with its housing allocations policy. The registered providers let the properties to the person nominated for the tenancy on a tenancy agreement in line with their own tenancy policies, and the local authority tenancy strategy should be taken into account by all registered providers when creating tenancies. Just in terms of the legal requirements, the Localism Act 2011, section 150, places a duty on every local housing authority to publish the tenancy strategy. We provided a strategy for 5 years and we'll review it on a regular basis. This is only a minor update to the current tenancy strategy. And that's all I want to say, really.
Thank you very much for that, Mark.
Thank you.
Scott.
I think it's a very, very sensible strategy, Chair. Don't know what much more I can add to that.
Thank you. I'm just interested in being as open and as transparent and sticking to process as much as we can. Our CLG colleagues, do you have any comments at all on this?
No, I'm very grateful that I was here and I observed how your meeting is, and because the way my English especially is not good, and
There is no...
yeah, because I have different idea in my mind that is, as a parent, being like that, because I'm old enough already to install some ways of raising.
Pete?
I do have a question, actually. How does the council deal with veterans? Because I'll give you an example. My friend, he was 17 years in the armed forces. He went back to the hometown where he lived, and they said to him, "You've been out the area for 17 years, we're not obliged to house you." That's got to be the craziest thing going, isn't it? You know? So he was homeless, but he's got a council place now, but it was half a battle, you know. 17 years.
I think that's a very fair point. I don't think we have that level of nuttiness, frankly, in this. Shane, you were nodding away merrily. The word crazy, which always interests me.
No, it's just that each local authority will have their own policy around their allocation policy as to what rules they have as to who can join the list. So different authorities will have different levels of time you might have to be in the area to join the list. And then there are whole sets of rules around having a local connection if you're homeless, but it very much depends on the facts of the case.
All I would say is I think that's absolutely fair. I've had to deal with various veterans cases since I resumed this role, and I think that the council officers have behaved very well, and I'm always referred to the Armed Forces champion who happens to be the leader of the council, which I think is a very good statement of intent. But I think you're right, everybody, Madam, we're all fellow humans, and that's absolutely important, and everyone's contribution is worthwhile value and of equal dignity, and that applies to veterans as well, Pete. And I know it's a priority both for my party in power and for Scott's Conservative Party in power.
Even those homelessness, I know their lives, how they become like that. Because, that's what I thought earlier on. But what can I do? I'm not. I have no power.
You have the power of being here, and you have the power of being listened to, and that is one of the most important things. And I think one of the interesting things about all three reports this evening is about treating people decently, treating people as individuals, looking at their own circumstances rather than believing one size fits all. And I think that's an important thing going forwards as we deal with housing in this city. Colleagues, I have one comment, which is I'm particularly impressed with point 6.2 in the housing strategy. Everybody's now looking. This is the point where we say, as we do with council properties, that we prefer and encourage housing associations to charge ideally social rents. We recognise that may not be true. The nature of government grants means that housing associations, like councils, may be forced to charge affordable rents which are okay for people on housing benefit. The local housing allowance, which is a whole different other ballgame. But I think it's important we send out that statement to housing associations just as we do to council developments. It's important that we charge things that are what people can really afford as often as we can, even if we can't force them, much though I would love to. I'm also interested on the idea of 5-year tenancies as well. I think that's a very, very good marker in the sand mark for our future discussions with our housing association colleagues. People want security with housing associations as they do in the private rented sector, and I'm grateful that that is in there. And on that basis, I'm delighted to approve this document. The meeting that now closes the meeting at 6:20. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you who survived the 110 minutes. It wasn't the 8-hour, 45-minute special of last week. But it's about as long as I think I can cope with. So, officer colleagues, thank you very much for your patience with us. All others, thank you very much for your patience with us, and have a safe trip home.